In this video, I'll be showing you how I painted my first 75mm display miniature and how it has changed the way I will approach many of my miniatures in the future. A friend of mine received this beautiful sculpt of the Horned Goddess from the Christopher Lovell display miniature Kickstarter from Rainer Roja and asked if I was interested in painting it for them. I rarely have the opportunity to paint models outside of the 28 and 32mm size, so I enthusiastically accepted. I have painted a couple of busts in the past and I found them to be excellent ways to develop painting techniques, so this was another chance to try and push my abilities as best as I could. The owner of the model is a fan of Christopher Lovell's art, so on their request I wanted to keep the painting of it as true to the art as I could. To help in preparing for this, I had to look at the color palette of the artwork, so I fired up GIMP, which is a free image editor similar in function to Photoshop, and started making color swatches for the skin tone, bone, hair and background. This particular piece of work has a lot of muted tones which are difficult to translate into miniature painting, as contrast is required to help the eye make out details of a miniature. To help me try to preserve the muted look, but also make the colours interesting, I imposed two rules to the paint scheme. The first was to avoid using white and black beyond the zenithal priming of the model. Whites and blacks reduce colour intensity, so instead we will use only colour value to help define shadows and highlights. Luckily, I have the Vallejo Nocturna Malefic skin tones set that should help me in producing this range of colours needed for the skin tones. The second rule is to use a couple of colours as the native colours of the piece. These colours will be introduced to all areas of the model by being mixed into any paint being applied. This should help tie all elements of the model together so that even contrasting colours still feel like they have a place in the theme. Before painting can begin, the model came in multiple parts, and these needed trimming and cleaning. The general mould of the miniature was very good, and there was very little needed to be done to prepare it. Where parts connected, however, more work had to be done. There was some snipping needed, and then checking with some dry fitting, I was happy to move on. Just as a painting needs a frame, a display model needs a plinth. I wanted the plinth to be true to the artwork, so looking at the background we can see it is almost black with a smattering of light at the top and a ruddy red-brown smearing at the bottom. This got my Silent Hill vibes peaked, and I imagined the ruddy red-brown as almost a living texture growing up from around the figure. I wanted to draw the viewer's eyes up to the head of the model, so I figured the base could support this if I used triangles. So rather than placing the model face on with a square plinth, I decided on placing her at a diagonal. I could then cut a corner of the square plinth and make a pyramid border at the back. That may be hitting the Silent Hill references on the nose a little, but I don't care. I felt Silent Hill is a pretty good inspiration for this piece. I mapped out the area I wanted to cut the wooden cube plinth and also marked out the background frame onto some Tamiya Pura plate. I then cut these out, making sure the joining edges were from the edge of the Pura plate so I knew that they would align correctly. It was then time to cut the wooden block. I got a saw and just went at it, following my guide as best as I could. It wasn't a perfect cut, but it was good enough for what I needed. I could then stick the Pura plate to the cube to create the backdrop for the plinth, using PVA glue and some tape to hold the pieces in place. With the plinth coming along, I turned my attention back to the model and gave all the pieces a quick bath in soapy water, gave them a gentle scrub with an old toothbrush and left them to dry. To help make the model sturdy, I wanted to pin her to the base. I made holes in the feet for some pins, and then, using some putty to help me align the pins, I also drilled into the plinth. I was still struggling with getting the alignment just right, so I reduced down to a single pin. I can tell you there is nothing scarier than drilling holes into somebody else's miniature. Now that I was happy with how the miniature would fit onto the plinth, the next step was to texture the display. I wanted the model to be removable but also fit into the display as naturally as possible. For this I used Vallejo thick mud acrylic and applied it pretty thickly all over the base of the plinth. This is why I wasn't too worried about the accuracy of the cut I had made, as I was going to cover it all in this wonderful goop. To get that Silent Hill effect, I plastered the mud up the wall as if it was climbing or spreading up the back of the display. I had some of it overlap onto the miniature's base as well to help blend it in, but I didn't cover too much as I wanted to keep many of the details there. I then very carefully removed the miniature from the base and left it to dry, leaving a perfect little space for the miniature to return to later. As the mud was almost dry, I removed the tape from the back of the display plinth and glued together the edges of the putter plate using CA glue. My motivation for the project was very high and I couldn't wait any longer, so I pulled out my wife's hairdryer and got that mud dry as quick as I could, because the next step was when I could start applying paint for the airbrush. I gave the whole plinth a coat of black primer. Once the base was coated, I turned to the model. I had not assembled the model as I wanted to paint the main body without anything blocking my brush. To protect the joints, I covered them with Post Attack and primed her black as well. Once the plinth was dry, I touched up some of the areas with more black primer using an old brush. I once again pulled out the airbrush and gave the model a white zenithal prime from above using Liquitex Inks Titanium White. Placing her back on the plinth, I could start to see the form coming together, and seeing how she stood out against the black of the zenithal prime kept a mental note to try and achieve a similar result from the final colour scheme. Putting some effort into making the plinth a decent representation of the original artwork's background colour, I mixed some titanium white ink and burnt umber ink to make an ivory colour that I used to spray on the light source that can be seen at the top of the picture. With my display plinth having the triangle at the top, it made for a good focal point for this light to be radiating out from. At the base of the original artwork there was a ruddy and dirty red. To make a colour like this, I mixed together Pyrrole red ink and carbon black ink into the remaining ivory I was using and adjusted the amounts until I had an approximate value of that in the original art. Once a layer of this was laid down, I then added vivid red orange to the mix and gave an extra layer that was a little bit lighter and could act as a highlight to add depth. I also applied these to the miniature's base as well so that the colours would match as closely as possible. Getting started with actually putting a brush to the model, I wanted to find the skin tone that would be present for the majority of the model. I also wanted to keep to a limited amount of colours that were muted but also had some contrasts, so using the swatches I had prepared earlier, I picked out 4 colours to use. Frozen Flesh for the midtones, Pale Flesh and White Flesh for the highlights, and Purple Shadow for the, well, shadows. These were all from the Malefic Skin Tones Nocturna range from Vallejo. I began on one of the arms and started with covering the skin with my midtone. I then made a value sketch by mixing my midtone and first highlight together to mark out where the highlights would fall. Once I was happy with light placement, I then added the shadow by using a finer pointed brush to place the shadow colour mixed with the midtone in all of the creases of the skin and under the muscle. I could then further exaggerate both of these by getting progressively darker or lighter in ever decreasing areas to give the impression of a gradient. Currently the gradient was pretty sloppy, but as a starting off point I was happy with the colour choice. I had managed to acquire contrast without using any black or white, and even though the skin was looking a lot more purple than the original artwork, I was happy with the tones. I continued to build up the skin tones across the rest of the upper body, putting most focus into the arms and face. I began with trying to layer the paints, but found that I was having more success at building the layers with stippling. The reason for switching to this method was that it sped up my painting process a great deal and helped me avoid getting any streaking lines that can easily occur when working with thinned down paint. It also meant that I could return to areas that needed an extra coat quickly and build a blend fairly effectively. There was still a lot of obvious brush strokes and poorly blended areas, but this would be remedied later. Right now it's more important to get the light values across the body looking correct. When approaching the rest of the upper body, I aim to achieve the same results, but with a darker light value. This way the piece should draw your eye up toward the head. Also, using the original artwork for guidance, the main glow of light is in the center of the chest. I approached the whole of the upper body with the same stippling technique, and with the practice I was getting, the results were looking a lot smoother. With the upper body done, it was time to paint the legs. The right leg is a little more forward than the left, so I was going to catch more light, but at the same time I didn't want to highlight it too much as to draw the eye away from the focal area of the model. I started with a little layering, following the curve of the legs to help define where the blends would occur. Once I was happy with the placement, I then transitioned back into stippling to help disguise the brush strokes and further improve the blends. With the skin all painted, at least for now, the scariest part of the painting was complete and I could now move over to the other parts of the miniature. I wanted to do some live streaming of my painting and forgot to record the footage directly, so this next part where I start the hair is taken from my stream. This is when I introduce a new colour, Vallejo model colour orange red, but to help keep it tied into the other colours of the miniature, I mixed the purple shadow into it. This then created an original colour for the hair, allowing it to stand out, but not appear at odds with the skin tone. The hair could then easily be highlighted by increasing the ratio of red-orange in the mix and reapplying it to the hair. The original artwork also has some turquoise braids, so I took the same approach by mixing Vallejo game color turquoise with the purple shadow. This then built up to the turquoise and I eventually mixed in some white flesh for the final highlight. Happy with how the braids were looking, all I had to do was apply the orange highlights and blue braids across the whole model, and this model has a lot of hair. Not jealous, I promise. With the hair and skin more or less finished, it was time to add the deer skull to the model. I stuck the pieces with CA glue and then left it to dry. Once dry, I primed the areas black and began with the arms, as I already knew what the colour scheme was for them. For the skull, I introduced another new colour with Vallejo Game Extra Opaque Heavy Brown. And again, to tie the colour in with the rest of the model, I mixed it with purple shadow. I changed up my technique for this part and decided to try some wet blending. This is where you apply the next layer before the previous is dry and create blends as the paint mixes as you apply it. I kept mixing more heavy brown into the mix and then eventually added white flesh for the final highlights. However, I wasn't completely happy with the results, so I recoated the skull and this time it used more stippling to paint more accurately to where I wanted the paint to go. I approached the antlers using the same colours, but where the skull leaned toward the heavy brown, the antlers had a higher ratio of purple shadow. This made the colours more subtle on the antlers and allowed the skull to be the centerpiece that draws the eye to it. With my bone colours on the wet palette, I also took the opportunity to paint the bones on the base of the model. Now that the majority of the model had been painted, I saw that my initial skin tones on the arms looked like they were reflecting too much light, and I went about toning these down by layering some thinned down midtones over the most egregious areas. This not only tied the model's colour schemes together more, but also helped blend the gradient more smoothly. I could then start on some of the smaller details and went about painting all of the small bones hanging from her body. These were very simple to accomplish as they acted as much smaller versions of the deer skull that I had already completed. Now to tackle the clothing. Well, article of clothing to be more exact. In the artwork it is pretty close to black, but as stated before, I wanted to avoid using black or white, so instead, to add some subtle contrast, I chose to make her clothing and accessories green. Using deep forest green and forest green from the same Malefic skin tone set, I used these with a touch of purple shadow to tie them into the rest of the model's colours. Happy with how it looked on her pants, I continued to use this colour scheme for all of her accessories. The model was now close to completion, but I was not happy with the blends on the skin. There were too many obvious brush marks and paint splotches, so with the help of Vallejo Glaze Medium, I worked on every rough gradient I found and smoothed them out with the appropriate colour to blend with. And here you can see the difference that it makes. It really helps make a good paint job become a great one. I could have continued making adjustments, but there is a time when you have to say that you have done enough and must finish the model. I had a go at marking the side of the plinth with the icon from the original artwork, and to help make the miniature easier to place onto the plinth and make it more secure, I replaced the pin with a magnet. Now, are you ready for the reveal? This has to be one of my best works to date. I was really happy that using native colours throughout helped tie everything together, and avoiding the use of blacks and whites allowed for the muted colour palette to still maintain contrast and vibrancy. Even though I'm proud of my work, it's far from perfect. I need to improve my ability with glazing to further improve the quality of my gradients, and take more time to give more flourish to the small details across a model. I enjoyed stippling so much, and I can see that as I improve this technique and pair it with glazing, I can produce far greater work in the future. I absolutely love this challenge, and I strongly recommend those of you who haven't tried this scale to have a go. Now, if you stayed all the way to the end, thank you so much. Please like and hit that subscribe button below, as this year I plan to be painting a lot more, and I can't wait to share more videos with you all. So, until next time, please remember, I used to paint like this.